How does someone born into rejection become a healer who never turned anyone away? What kind of love can see Christ in a rat, a dog, and a dying slave with equal clarity? And why did the man society deemed unworthy become the saint whose intercession millions seek when facing impossible situations? How can a man born into rejection become a mirror of divine compassion? This is the story of Saint Martin de Porres, the healer who loved the forgotten. If you've ever felt judged by circumstances beyond your control, or wondered whether one person can really make a difference against systemic injustice, this story will show you that divine love recognizes no human boundaries, and that true greatness is measured not by status, but by service. And if stories like this remind you that love can rise from the lowest places, hit like and subscribe for more tales of faith that prove ordinary lives can carry extraordinary grace. In the Spanish colonial city of Lima, Peru, on the 9th of December, 1579, a child was born who would one day prove that God's grace operates beyond every human prejudice and social barrier. Martin de Porres entered a world where the color of his skin determined his value, where his illegitimate birth marked him as shameful, and where Spanish law explicitly limited what someone of mixed African and European heritage could achieve. Picture colonial Lima, a city of sharp contrasts where Spanish conquistadors lived in mansions while indigenous peoples and African slaves labored in poverty. The rigid caste system of colonial America placed people in hierarchies based on race, pure-blooded Spanish at the top, and those of mixed heritage occupying ambiguous middle positions that denied them full participation in either culture. Martin's father, Juan de Porres, was a Spanish nobleman who had come to Peru seeking fortune. His mother, Ana Velázquez, was a freed black woman, likely a former slave, who made her living through manual labor. Their relationship was common enough in colonial society but carried no honor. Spanish men routinely fathered children with indigenous and African women while maintaining that such relationships were beneath their dignity. When Martin was born, his father refused to acknowledge him. The child's dark skin was too visible a reminder of an affair that Spanish society considered shameful. For the first 8 years of his life, Martin grew up in poverty with his mother and younger sister, learning early what it meant to be unwanted by the world. What shapes a child who is rejected before he can even understand why? But Martin's early experiences of poverty and prejudice were laying the foundations for his future ministry in ways that privilege never could have. He learned to see the world from the perspective of the forgotten, the slaves, the sick, the abandoned children who had no voice in colonial society. When Martin was 8, his father finally acknowledged him and his sister, providing them with education and a small allowance. But this recognition came with painful conditions. Juan de Porres made clear that while he would support his mixed-race children financially, he would never claim them publicly as his legitimate heirs. Martin attended school in Lima, where his intelligence impressed teachers, but his skin color excluded him from the opportunities available to Spanish children. He excelled at learning, but understood that no amount of academic achievement would change how society viewed him. As a teenager, Martin was apprenticed to a barber surgeon, one of the few professions open to someone of his background. In colonial times, barbers performed not just haircuts, but also basic medical procedures, bloodletting, tooth extraction, and treatment of wounds. It was practical training that would serve Martin's future ministry in unexpected ways. But Martin's greatest education was happening in his interior life, where he was developing a relationship with God that transcended every earthly limitation. At age 15, Martin felt called to religious life with an intensity that could not be ignored. He approached the Dominican Priory of the Holy Rosary in Lima, asking to be admitted as a brother. But even in the church, colonial racism created barriers that seemed insurmountable. Picture Martin standing before the priory gates, knowing that Spanish law explicitly prohibited men of African or indigenous heritage from taking full religious vows. The best he could hope for was admission as a donato, a lay helper who lived in the monastery and assisted the priests, but could never become a full member of the religious community. The Dominicans agreed to accept Martin in this limited role, assigning him the humblest tasks in the community: cleaning, laundry, kitchen work, and caring for the sick brothers in the infirmary. He would live under the same roof as the priests, but would never share their status, celebrate Mass, or participate fully in the religious life he had felt called to embrace. For most people, such rejection would have bred resentment or despair. But Martin accepted his position with humility that amazed everyone who knew him. He seemed to understand that true service to God was not about status or recognition, but about love expressed through concrete actions. His work in the monastery's infirmary revealed gifts that went far beyond his barber-surgeon training. Martin possessed an intuitive understanding of medicine and healing that seemed to come from a source beyond human learning. Brothers who were ill began requesting Martin's care specifically, finding that his treatments were more effective than those of trained physicians. But it was Martin's supernatural abilities that began to attract real attention. Brothers reported that Martin seemed to know when someone was ill before symptoms appeared, that he could be in 2 places at once, and that his prayers produced healings that defied medical explanation. How do you explain abilities that transcend every natural law? The priory's superior began noticing other extraordinary phenomena surrounding Martin. He was often found in ecstasy during prayer, levitating above the ground. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him in 2 locations simultaneously, caring for a sick brother in the infirmary while also being spotted in the chapel or even in distant countries on missions of mercy. Most remarkably, Martin demonstrated a gift for communicating with animals that seemed more like Adam in Eden than a servant in colonial Lima. Mice, rats, and dogs all responded to his gentle commands, and he treated them with the same compassion he showed to humans. One famous incident involved the monastery's cat, dog, and mice, who were constantly fighting. Martin spoke to them firmly about living in peace and sharing their food. Witnesses reported seeing these natural enemies eating peacefully from the same bowl after Martin's intervention, a living parable of the harmony that divine love can create even among traditional adversaries. But Martin's most important ministry was about to begin, and it would challenge every assumption about who deserved care and compassion. As Martin's reputation for healing grew, people began coming to the monastery seeking his help. But the ones who sought him most desperately were those whom society had completely abandoned. Slaves suffering from diseases their owners wouldn't treat, indigenous peoples dying from European diseases, and street children with nowhere else to turn. Picture Martin moving through Lima's poorest neighborhoods, his simple Dominican habit a familiar sight as he brought medicine, food, and hope to people whom the colonial system had deemed expendable. He treated infected wounds on slaves' bodies, cared for indigenous children orphaned by epidemics, and sat with dying beggars whom everyone else avoided. But Martin quickly realized that emergency care wasn't enough. The forgotten needed a place where they could receive sustained treatment, where their dignity as children of God would be recognized, regardless of their race or social status. He needed a hospital for those whom no hospital would accept. With donations he collected from wealthy benefactors, whom he charmed through the sheer force of his evident holiness, Martin established an informal hospital in his sister's house. Here, he brought the sick and dying whom Lima's official medical institutions refused, providing them with the same quality of care that Spanish nobles received from private physicians. The work was overwhelming. Lima's streets were filled with suffering, abandoned slaves, dying of infections, indigenous peoples ravaged by European diseases to which they had no immunity, mixed-race children, whose very existence society pretended not to see. Martin worked with supernatural energy that amazed everyone who knew him. He seemed to require almost no sleep, appearing fresh for his monastery duties at dawn after spending entire nights caring for the dying in his makeshift hospital. Have you ever witnessed someone whose capacity for compassion seemed literally infinite? But Martin's ministry went beyond physical healing to address the spiritual and emotional wounds that colonial racism inflicted. He treated each person with a dignity that their society denied, speaking to slaves as equals, honoring indigenous people's humanity, and showing mixed-race children that their existence was not shameful, but precious in God's eyes. His approach scandalized many Spanish colonists who believed that maintaining social hierarchies was essential to colonial order. They argued that treating slaves and indigenous peoples with such compassion would make them forget their place and threaten the system that Spanish prosperity depended upon. But Martin was challenging more than social customs. He was demonstrating an alternative vision of human society based on divine love rather than racial hierarchies. His hospital was a prophetic sign of the kingdom of God, where the first would be last and the forgotten would be cherished. The miracles that occurred in Martin's care became impossible to deny, and they would eventually force even his religious order to reconsider who was truly worthy of full recognition. The supernatural phenomena surrounding Martin de Porres became so frequent and well documented that even skeptics had to acknowledge that something extraordinary was happening through this humble lay brother. Picture the growing collection of testimonies from credible witnesses, priests, physicians, and government officials, all attesting to miracles they had personally observed. Martin's gift for healing extended beyond natural medicine into the realm of the miraculous. Brothers who were dying from serious illnesses recovered overnight after Martin prayed over them. Wounds that physicians said would require amputation healed completely under his care. Diseases that should have been fatal simply disappeared after his intervention. But perhaps most remarkable were his gifts of bilocation and supernatural knowledge. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing Martin in two places simultaneously, caring for the sick in Lima while also appearing to missionaries in distant parts of South America or even in Asia and Africa, bringing comfort to those who needed it most. One particularly well-documented case involved a Spanish official who was dying in a remote village where no medical help was available. His family later testified that Martin appeared at his bedside, administered treatment, and disappeared before anyone could question how he had traveled hundreds of miles through difficult terrain in a matter of hours. Martin also demonstrated precognition, knowing about events before they occurred. He would begin preparing food for unexpected guests before they arrived, gather medical supplies before news of an accident reached the monastery, and pray for people who were in danger before anyone knew they needed help. The Dominican Order found itself in an awkward position. Here was someone they had accepted only as a lay helper because of racial laws, yet he was performing miracles that exceeded anything the fully professed priests could claim. His sanctity was becoming too obvious to ignore, his supernatural gifts too well documented to dismiss. What do you do when someone you've rejected because of their race proves to be holier than anyone in your community? In 1603, after 9 years as a lay helper, Martin's superiors made an unprecedented decision. They allowed him to take full religious vows as a Dominican brother, making him a complete member of the order despite the laws that technically prohibited it. It was a tacit admission that divine grace operated beyond colonial racial codes, but even full recognition within the order didn't change Martin's ministry or attitude. He continued to perform the humblest tasks alongside his care for the sick, never seeking higher office or special recognition. When asked why he seemed content with such lowly work, he replied that he was unworthy to be anything but a dog at the feet of Christ. His humility was genuine, but it coexisted with a fierce commitment to justice for the forgotten. Martin used his growing influence to advocate for better treatment of slaves and indigenous peoples, arguing that their humanity demanded recognition regardless of colonial laws or social customs. The miracles continued and intensified, but Martin's greatest legacy was being built in the transformed lives of people whom society had written off as worthless. One of Martin's most distinctive characteristics was his extraordinary relationship with animals, which seemed to transcend normal bounds of nature. Picture Martin speaking gently to the monastery's mice and rats, creatures that everyone else wanted to exterminate, treating them with the same compassion he showed to human beings. His fellow Dominicans were often scandalized when Martin brought sick or injured animals into the monastery for care. He established a shelter for stray dogs and cats at his sister's house, feeding them from his own portions and nursing them back to health with the same attention he gave to humans. The famous story of Martin reprimanding the monastery's mice for eating stored grain became emblematic of his approach to all creation. Instead of setting traps, he spoke to the mice respectfully, explaining that the grain belonged to the monastery, but promising to feed them daily if they would stop their raids. Witnesses claim the mice listened and relocated themselves to the garden, where Martin faithfully brought them food scraps each day. This radical compassion extended to all creation, reflecting Martin's deep conviction that every creature, no matter how small or despised, bore the mark of its creator and deserved care and respect. But Martin's influence reached far beyond animals to the highest levels of colonial society. Despite his humble status, Martin became spiritual advisor to some of Lima's most powerful figures, including the Archbishop and the Viceroy of Peru. What made aristocrats seek counsel from someone their society deemed inferior? The answer lay in Martin's evident holiness and supernatural wisdom. When wealthy individuals came to him seeking spiritual guidance, they encountered someone who was completely immune to intimidation by their status and utterly indifferent to their wealth. Martin spoke to viceroys with the same gentle directness he used with slaves, making clear that before God, all were equally in need of mercy. His advice was sought in matters of conscience, morality, and justice. Spanish officials who came to confession found Martin gently but firmly challenging their participation in systems of exploitation. He didn't condemn them personally, but helped them see how colonial structures harmed the people Christ loved. The Archbishop of Lima, Feliciano de Vega, became one of Martin's closest friends, despite the vast social distance between them. The prelate often visited Martin's hospital, witnessing firsthand the miracles of healing and the radical love that motivated his ministry. This relationship between the highest church official in Peru and the mixed-race lay brother demonstrated that authentic holiness transcends every human barrier. The Archbishop recognized in Martin a sanctity that outshone any achievement of education, ordination, or social status. But Martin's time on earth was drawing to a close, and his final illness would provide one last demonstration of the supernatural grace that had marked his entire life. In 1639, at age 60, Martin de Porres fell seriously ill with what appears to have been either malaria or a severe infection. Picture the monastery infirmary, where Martin had cared for so many others, now receiving him as a patient. The brothers gathered around his bed, hoping to repay in some small measure the decades of care he had given them. But even in his final illness, Martin continued to demonstrate the supernatural gifts that had characterized his life. He accurately predicted the day and hour of his death, made provisions for the care of his hospital patients after his passing, and gave specific instructions about how his modest possessions should be distributed to the poor. The Viceroy of Peru himself came to visit Martin on his deathbed, kneeling beside the bed of the man whom society had once deemed unworthy of full religious vows. The most powerful political figure in colonial South America sought the dying man's blessing and prayers, a final reversal of the social hierarchies that had marked Martin's life. The Archbishop came daily to Martin's bedside, administering the sacraments and seeking his counsel even as death approached. Members of Lima's nobility crowded into the monastery, all wanting to be present for the holy death they were certain was occurring. On the 3rd of November 1639, surrounded by his Dominican brothers and many of the people whose lives he had transformed, Martin de Porres died peacefully. His final words were reported to be prayers of gratitude for the privilege of serving God through serving the forgotten. What happens when someone who was rejected by the world departs from it with such obvious sanctity? The immediate aftermath of Martin's death demonstrated how completely his life had transformed perceptions. The funeral procession drew enormous crowds, including Spanish nobles, African slaves, indigenous peoples, and mixed-race individuals, all walking together in grief, united by their love for a man who had loved them all equally. Miracles were reported at Martin's tomb almost immediately. People who touched his body or prayed near his grave reported healings, conversions, and supernatural experiences. The cult of devotion that would eventually lead to his canonization began within hours of his death. The colonial officials, who had once enforced laws keeping people like Martin in subordinate positions, now competed for relics from his body, scraps of his habit, hairs from his head, anything that might carry the spiritual power that had been so evident in his life. Saint Martin de Porres was beatified in 1837 and canonized by Pope John XXIII in 1962, becoming the first Black saint of the Americas. His feast day, November 3, is celebrated particularly in communities working for racial justice and in hospitals serving the poor. Today, Martin's legacy extends far beyond the Catholic Church. He is honored as a pioneer of social justice, a model of interracial harmony, and a demonstration that sanctity transcends every human prejudice. His life provides a blueprint for challenging systemic racism through radical love, rather than merely condemning it through rhetoric. Modern devotion to Saint Martin focuses particularly on his ministry to the forgotten, the sick, the poor, the marginalized, and the animals that even poverty-stricken humans often mistreat. His image appears in hospitals, veterinary clinics, and social justice organizations worldwide. His miraculous healing gifts continue through his intercession. Countless people report healings attributed to his prayers, particularly in cases involving serious illnesses affecting poor communities with limited access to medical care. But perhaps Martin's greatest legacy is his demonstration that no human being should be judged by circumstances beyond their control. Born illegitimate, mixed race, and poor, he could have allowed these limitations to define his life. Instead, he transcended them through love that recognized the divine image in every creature. The man whom colonial law deemed unworthy of full religious vows became one of the Church's most beloved saints, proving that God's grace operates beyond every human prejudice and that true greatness is measured not by status but by service. From the streets of colonial Lima to hospitals worldwide, from rejected child to universal saint, Saint Martin de Porres continues to remind us that divine love recognizes no boundaries and that the forgotten are often the ones God remembers most clearly.